The telephone rang through to the White House just after 9:30 on the evening of May 15, 1940. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat at his desk in the Oval Study, the tall windows open to let in the cool spring air, when the operator connected him to London. On the other end of the line was a man who had been Prime Minister of Britain for barely 5 days, Winston Churchill. Roosevelt listened as Churchill spoke, his usually commanding voice laced with urgency and strain. German panzer divisions had smashed through French defenses at Sedan, cutting a devastating path toward the English Channel, threatening to split the Allied armies in two. France was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined, and the British Expeditionary Force risked encirclement. Churchill's plea was immediate, desperate, but also resolute. Britain would not surrender, no matter the odds, no matter the darkness ahead. It would fight on alone if necessary. Roosevelt replaced the receiver on its cradle, sitting very still. Outside, Washington hummed its quiet night rhythm. Streetlights glimmered along Pennsylvania Avenue, the distant sounds of traffic echoing faintly. But the calm of the city belied the storm of thought raging in the president's mind. He understood now that Europe's crisis was no longer abstract. It was real, immediate, and terrifying. If France fell, and Britain stood alone, only 3,000 miles of ocean separated Nazi Germany from American shores. The speed of France's collapse stunned even Germany's generals. On May 10th, the day Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister, German forces surged forward, armored divisions crossing the Meuse River and racing toward the coast. Within days, the French army, the so-called strongest in Europe, was unraveling. British and French soldiers were being pushed into an ever-shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. On May 20th, Roosevelt convened his cabinet. Around the room sat men representing every shade of American opinion about the war in Europe. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, cautious and legalistic, fretted over the constraints of the Neutrality Acts. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes argued forcefully for aiding Britain and France. Secretary of War Harry Woodring, staunchly isolationist, urged complete disengagement from Europe's conflict. Roosevelt listened to them all, revealing nothing. When he finally spoke, his words were calm but carried a hidden weight. America must do everything possible to help the Allies short of actually entering the war. The political reality was stark. The American people were not ready to fight. Polls revealed a nation haunted by memories of the First World War. More than 80% supported Britain and France in principle, but only 13% favored sending troops abroad. Roosevelt understood this, yet he also understood the stakes. Europe's survival mattered to American security in ways that many in Congress could not yet grasp. As May turned into June, the crisis deepened. Belgium surrendered on May 28, leaving a dangerous gap in the Allied lines and intensifying the pressure around Dunkirk. In London, Churchill faced a cabinet divided over Britain's future. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, urged exploring peace with Hitler. Britain's forces were trapped, the threat of bombing and invasion looming. Any negotiations, Halifax argued, might preserve some of the empire. But Churchill's response was blunt and unwavering. Nations that surrendered went extinct, those that fought could rise again. Hitler's promises were worthless. Britain would fight on, and if necessary, fight alone. Meanwhile, the evacuation at Dunkirk began on May 27. For 9 days, the Royal Navy and hundreds of civilian vessels crossed the English Channel, braving relentless artillery and air attacks to rescue soldiers from the beaches. By June 4, more than 330,000 troops had been pulled from the jaws of disaster. It was a military catastrophe disguised as a miracle. Equipment, vehicles, tanks, and artillery were abandoned, but the army itself survived. That evening, Churchill addressed Parliament. His speech echoed across the Atlantic, reaching Roosevelt in the White House. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Roosevelt listened closely, sensing the iron determination beneath the words. If Britain endured, there remained hope that Hitler could be stopped without American soldiers ever crossing the ocean, but only if Britain held fast. France formally surrendered on June 22, signing the armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler personally insisted on the location for symbolic humiliation, and German troops marched into Paris. The French government relocated to Vichy, collaborating with the occupiers. Britain now stood entirely alone. Roosevelt faced a dilemma both simple and maddeningly complex. He wanted to help Britain. He knew American security depended on its survival. But the Neutrality Acts, passed by Congress in the late 1930s, made any direct aid illegal. Selling arms, extending loans, or transporting materials into combat zones was forbidden. Roosevelt began searching for legal loopholes. The first opportunity emerged with Britain's desperate need for destroyers. Its navy had suffered losses, and the Atlantic convoys required protection. America had dozens of aging destroyers left idle since the First World War. A direct transfer was illegal, but Roosevelt's Attorney General suggested a workaround. Britain could lease U.S.-controlled bases in the Caribbean and Atlantic in exchange for the ships. The trade could be framed as a neutral exchange between friendly nations. Churchill reluctantly agreed. In September 1940, the "destroyers for bases" deal was announced. But Britain's needs far outstripped 50 ships. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition were required to sustain a modern war. By December, Churchill wrote Roosevelt, warning that Britain was running out of money. Roosevelt, aboard the USS Tuscaloosa, considered the problem deeply. Congress would never approve a massive loan, and American public opinion would not tolerate direct gifts of billions of dollars. Neutrality laws blocked every obvious path forward. Roosevelt found his solution. On December 17, 1940, he told reporters a story. Imagine your neighbor's house is on fire. You lend him a hose to put out the flames, expecting it back later. Britain was the neighbor, Hitler the fire, and the hose American weapons and supplies. Under this Lend-Lease plan, the United States would provide military aid to any nation vital to American security, without immediate payment. Critics, especially isolationists like Senator Burton Wheeler, denounced the plan as reckless. Roosevelt struck back at their attacks, framing support for Lend-Lease as patriotic and opposition as unpatriotic. The bill, deliberately numbered H.R. 1-1776, echoed America's founding, casting Britain's fight as America's own. After 2 months of fierce debate, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act on March 11, 1941. Roosevelt signed it the same day, committing the United States to supplying Britain with the full productive power of its industry. Churchill, in London, felt overwhelming relief. Supplies would flow, and Britain could continue fighting. Roosevelt remained measured in public statements, avoiding dramatic proclamations, but his message was clear. Britain's defense was America's defense. From that moment, America was engaged, already fighting a de facto naval war in the Atlantic, supplying billions in weapons, equipment, and provisions to allies even before Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt's strategy was careful, step by step, always staying just ahead of public opinion, balancing political constraints with the demands of survival. When Pearl Harbor finally drew America into open conflict, the groundwork was already laid. Germany came first, Roosevelt had declared privately, and the Allied war effort was fully underway. By April 1945, Roosevelt would die weeks before victory in Europe. Yet the decisions he made in the 18 months following that pivotal phone call on May 15, 1940, had ensured Britain would not stand alone. Hitler would be defeated, the war won, and Roosevelt's steady, calculated leadership vindicated. The story of Lend-Lease, of destroyers for bases, of quiet diplomacy and relentless political maneuvering, was a testament to the power of patience, foresight, and courage. The call from Churchill had been brief, urgent, and almost casual in its urgency. Yet it set into motion a chain of decisions that changed the course of history. Roosevelt's response was measured, deliberate, and decisive. It was the answer to a question that had haunted him since the war began. Could America remain isolated? The answer, forged in the crucible of Europe's darkest hour, was no. America could not stand aside. From that night onward, Britain would never truly fight alone, and in that commitment lay the path to Allied victory.